over now. No, I'm just kidding. I'm not going to start over.
I did not want to interrupt you in the. I don't want to interrupt you in the middle of that nice introduction, Dave. Okay, let's see if it works.
My bad. I forgot. Go ahead.
Oh.
We are recording.
Wait. I'm coming. Oh, well, that didn't help. Okay, so don't look. I'm going back. I'm so accomplished at this. We would say I'd never do this, huh? Okay, so I'm going to start with a very brief introduction of what we know about smoke exposure on grapes and wine, and then a little bit about what I've been doing and what my next steps are, and then I'll pass the ball to Tom. So basically, let's first take one step back. What is a wine taint? So a wine taint is when you have something from outside coming in and it overpowers a wine, suppressing all other characteristics and making the wine one-dimensional. Now, in the case of smoke taint, that is when you get this very overpowering characteristic, smoky, burnt, campfire, medicinal, or earthy characters on the nose, and then the distinctive retronasal ashtray kind of character at the back of your throat. So that's very distinctive for smoke taint. Now, something to point out, just because you observe some smokiness in a wine, obviously doesn't mean that it was smoke impacted, because we all know that we pay a lot of money to put wine into toasted oak barrels, which can give you very similar aromas. Smoke taint really here is an example of too much of a good thing is not a good thing anymore. Okay, at low levels, it is actually a good thing. At high levels, it's just too much. So what happens during wildfires? During wildfire, you have a lot of vegetation and wood burning. Now, wood consists 15 to 25% out of lignin. Now, lignin is what gives wood its structure. It's the vegetable, the crunch in your vegetable. So basically, if you look at the structure, when it burns, it thermally degrades and releases massive amounts of volatile phenols. And the one I show you there, that is guaiacol, but it can be a range of other volatile phenols as well. And because they're volatile, they can disperse in the air. They can also be carried away on ash and other debris that's in the air and travel a little bit further. We also know that they can absorb onto grape leaves as well as the grapes themselves. So what happens? Basically, it goes through that waxy layer. It gets absorbed into the skin itself, where it quickly gets glycosylated. We think this is part of the defense mechanism of the plant. And basically, when it's glycosylated, there's enzymes that can attach a mono, a di, or a tri sugar onto these volatile phenols. Now, in the beginning at the right, you can see we only really analyze guaiacol and 4-methyl guaiacol. But then the predictive power to predict whether smoke impact is going to be a factor was really, really poor. Now, most researchers will include at least these 7 volatile phenols, as well as their various glycosylated sugars when we analyze wines and try to predict whether these wines will end up being smoke impacted or not. So there was also this very interesting study done in Australia over 3 seasons on Merlot vines. They exposed the vines for 3 seasons at key growth stages. And this is the one study we're all still referencing when people ask us, when are grapes sensitive to smoke exposure? Basically what they found is if you have a grape, it can be impacted. However, the sensitivity to that impact increases as it progresses in ripeness. From like a week after veraison until harvest, it was the most susceptible to smoke exposure. Now, even within that range, it's true that to the point of harvest time, there was a slight decrease again. This may be due to decrease in enzymatic activity. We do not know. We've only have this one study that we're all referencing. The only good fact here is that there's no carryover of smoke-related compounds from the one season to the next. I'm only talking now about smoke impact, not about other related fire impacts. So basically, because it's only absorbing on the grapes and the leaves, they don't overwinter, so the next year you start from fresh. Now during winemaking, when you crush the fruit, all your volatile phenols, both free and bound, that's in the skins, extract very quickly into the wine itself. Within a day, you can get 30%. It grows quickly. Within 5 days, you have more than 80% that's in the grapes. So it extracts really quickly. And basically what you also can get is during winemaking and aging, you can slow hydrolysis of the bound volatile phenols to form free volatile phenols. So that ratio is always changing because wine have a pH of 3.2 to 4. People have looked into treating wines with different types of enzymes to try and release everything into the free form. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find any enzyme that actually has any significant impact. Neither am I aware of any researcher that have found any success doing that. So in 2017, I started my research when we had the fires in Napa and Sonoma and Mendocino Lake counties. And the first thing I did was look at all the suggestions made based on Australian research about things that we can do to mitigate. Okay, your grapes were smoke exposed. You can't do anything about it. Is there anything we can do in the winery? And basically what we found was there's no long-term solution. It's a little bit like a Band-Aid, but it doesn't heal the wound because I mean, using a fruity yeast and using some oak adducts did help on the nose to hide smokiness. Unfortunately, you have that ashtray character, and if that's there, it just seems to come back all the time. So now we're saying, basically, if you're talking about a red wine, it's either a rosé, and only if the smoke impact wasn't too severe, or just make the best red wine you can and focus on emulation. Now, I looked at enzyme treatment. Like I said, it didn't really work very well. I also looked at fining, activated charcoal, molecular and printed polymers fining, as well as the reverse osmosis, both the standard process and the differential filtration process, and then the spinning cone technology. What you're looking at here at the bottom, you'll see there's a lot of 1s, 2s, 3s, and 4s. So that's 4 different wines with various levels of smoke impact that we made during the 2017 and 2018 fires. They're all Cabernet Sauvignons, all made exactly the same way. What you can see, and this is only the free volatile phenols that we analyze, we're still getting the total phenol and the bound numbers. COVID-19 has delayed me like 3 to 6 months at the moment, but we'll get there. But if you look at the free volatile phenols, you'll see that all the techniques were successful in decreasing the number. And in general, molecular and printed polymers actually work the best, followed by activated charcoal, then reverse osmosis, and the spinning cone. We also did descriptive analysis. Unfortunately, we couldn't do descriptive analysis on the molecular and printed polymers. There was a sulfur dioxide problem on the nose, although it worked the best. We'll get back to those wines. But if you look here at the principal component analysis, this is only the 10 sensory attributes that were significantly different. If you look at the right, you'll see ash. That is that ashtray character, retronasal ashtray character. And the peat, wood, and smoke, that is on the nose. Now, first, we had 2 controls that weren't exposed to smoke ever. And that's good. They were not seen as smoke at all. That's the first thing you want. Secondly, if you really look, you will see on the left hand, you have a lot of 3s and 4s. That's wine 3 and 4. Basically, all the treatments for wine 3 and 4 really were pretty successful in removing any kind of ashtray, smoky character from the wine. Those were also the 2 wines that were the least impacted by smoke and had the lowest amount of volatile phenols. Those that were more highly impacted, it wasn't that successful. Now, it's very difficult to relate the volatile phenol number only with the sensory attributes. We're also looking at other matrix effects, phenolics, general aroma compounds, and like I said, the bound volatile phenols as well, because it does not have currently good predictive power about what should be the most smoky or the least smoky. What I will suggest is that for me, 2 of the wines were impacted in such a way that they either needed multiple treatments or really it's a wine that you needed to blend. When you felt the smoke impact numbers were low enough to have a low risk for blending. You need to do bench trials. Just because a specific technique works for one wine doesn't mean it's going to work for another because of matrix effects. So basically what I'm saying is we're really still working on predicting smoke impact on wines based on chemical composition. It's either because we don't have all the marker compounds or because we're not looking at all the matrix effects. We know that fruity esters suppresses smoke taint. We know that green character enhances it. We know phenolics, alcohol, sugar, all of that has an impact. It's probably a combination of both to improve our predictive powers. And I know Elizabeth is going to say something about that too. Then next steps. We really want to focus on, okay, when do you sample? How do you process that sample? And what's the best analytical techniques that we can use? I want to look back into the kinetics of volatile phenol absorption. There's not a lot of work on that. We don't know really what the differences among different varieties are. We know that they naturally have free bound volatile phenols. We know there's differences in their natural amounts, but we don't specifically know why. And also this whole question of translocation of volatile phenols from the leaves to the berry. Some studies find there's something, others find there's nothing. It really hasn't been fully laid to rest and needs to be investigated fully. Then we're looking at grape sprays, anything to protect the grapes. Can we measure something in the vineyard to predict smoke taint risk without having to do detailed analytical analysis on grapes themselves? And then relating smoke composition to smoke exposure risk. Tom is also working on this, looking at the composition of the smoke itself, the density of the smoke, what's the impact of repeated exposure and the length of exposure, and can we relate that to smoke impact risk? So just quickly, up to now, this is the funding that I used to do the research. American Vineyard Foundation, Dan and Ron Miller Charitable Fund, Lions Cisneros Family Research Fund, Napa Valley Witness, Wine Business Monthly, and Rossi Endowment. Without money, we can't do anything. Thank you very much. And now I'm passing the ball to Tom as soon as I stop sharing my screen. Hope that was not more than 10 minutes.
All right, let's see if we can do this. All right, so you should see my screen, right?
Yes.
Yes.
All right, so great introduction, and I'll spend the next few minutes talking just about the program that we have for research in smoke taint and mitigation of smoke-affected wines. I'm based at the Wine Science Center, the St. Michel Wine Science Center in Richland and the Tri-Cities campus for WSU. Let's see. So this is where I spend much of the summer. Starting in 2016, we, with funding from the Washington Wine Commission, designed and built a system that allows us to deliberately smoke grapevines. We do this at our ag center near Prosser. And initially we had two houses, one that we use for smoking and one that we use for control. We have a nice side firebox smoker that we use to generate the smoke. And then we have a series of fans and pipes that deliver the smoke into the smokehouse. This is what it looks on the inside. We've actually refined this now so that the 4-inch irrigation line that carries the smoke through the vineyard is now connected. We typically attach it to the fruiting wire so that the smoke is directly in the same, very close in proximity to where the fruiting zone is. We found, particularly if there was any kind of a breeze, having the smoke in the center of the greenhouse or hoop house was less effective. So we've modified this a little bit, but this is what it looks like. This is a 200-foot long hoop house that encloses 60 grapevines. And we do smoke and we do control. And in 2019, so last season, we constructed some additional hoop house modules so that we now have a total of 6. And we use 3 for smoke and 3 for control. So we can do replicated smoke exposures and controls and do full randomized designs for that, allowing for some buffer spaces between the smoke houses so that we don't have carryover. So a lot of 2019 season was really focused on just using these new smoke houses to really understand how reproducible our smoke exposures were and what were the best ways for actually measuring smoke intensity that we were generating and how to collect smoke. I mean, we had done this previously, but this allowed, by having the extra houses, we could now really understand how reproducible our exposures were to give us a better feel for how much smoke does it take before we see an effect. So that was one of our key projects, was just building the additional houses and doing some reproducibility of our exposures. And then the other two that I want to talk about, these were two of 3 or 4 other projects that we worked on last year. The first is this idea of a barrier spray, something that you could spray in the vineyard as a means of protecting the fruit or the vine from the effects of the smoke. So we'll talk a little bit about that. And then we did an evaluation of bucket fermentations as a tool for predicting what the outcome might be in wines made from affected fruit. So we'll just start with those. The first is this barrier spray program. And this was a project that we were able to do with support from the Murdoch Charitable Trust, which funds a program called the Partners in Science, which basically allows me to have a local high school science teacher work in my lab for 2 summers. So the first summer he was here, we set up this trial and did some initial work with it. Then last summer, Rafe Peterson is the teacher that I've worked with. He's at a high school here in Pasco. We used sprays of kaolin and then a second related product that I can't really name just yet. We used a hand sprayer to spray them onto the vines the night before we started our smoke exposures. So we had replications of vines throughout each of our hoop houses, both control and smoked hoop houses. So in the control houses, we did the kaolin sprays and the other product just as we did in the smoke houses, so we could look at whether there was any impact from the spray itself on the controls. And again, sprayed the day before we start our exposures, which were typically about 48 hours. So he sprayed these 2 things. We did our smoke exposures. And then after the fact, we looked at guaiacol, 4-methyl-guaiacol, the normal range of volatile phenols that people are looking at. I'm just showing guaiacol here. On the left-hand side are the control fruit from the control houses. So Control X is just control not sprayed, control with kaolin, and then control with the other product. And our controls at least work. We don't have any guaiacol in our control fruit. That's good. Whether it was sprayed or unsprayed, there's no guaiacol. In the smoked unsprayed, we had on a microgram per gram basis, not quite 6 micrograms of guaiacol per gram of skin tissue. In the grapes that were sprayed with kaolin prior to application, we were down to about 3.5. And the other product brought it down a little bit further to about 3.1 micrograms per gram. So based on these results, we'll continue to do some additional work with these. We have some other products that we want to look at as well. And I'll talk more about that at the end. And then the second sort of big project for last year was doing an evaluation of bucket fermentations. There was a fire in July of 2019 that affected a vineyard on the Wallug Slope, about an hour's drive from the Wine Science Center. The fruit was rejected by the wineries it was intended to go to. So the grower, in hopes of making the best of the bad situation, donated the fruit to us. We did a series of bucket fermentations versus macro bin scale fermentations with the same fruit. There were 4 varieties we looked at: Cabernet, Petit Verdot, Grenache, and Syrah. And for each variety, we picked a block that was relatively high and relatively low based on testing of the fruit, but also based on proximity to the fire line. This fire burned down the hill to the top of the vineyard, and in some cases into the top sections of the vineyard. And so the way this particular vineyard is laid out, for each variety, there were blocks that were higher on the hill and closer to the fire, and blocks that were lower on the hill and a little further away from the fire and less smoke exposure. And so we had a high block and a low block for each. I will say the Cabernet blocks were both kind of lower down on the hill, and while they were higher and lower, they were generally less affected than the other varieties. So again, just looking at guaiacol content, we looked at other things as well, and the results are fairly similar. In each case, so on the left, we've got Petit Verdot, then Grenache, Cabernet, and Syrah. within each variety, I'm showing the low block on the left and the high block on the right. And within each of those, the bucket fermentation value is on the left and the macro bin fermentation value is on the right. And so what we were trying to understand, irrespective of high versus low, is were the results from the buckets predictive or close? Would they be able to tell us something about how impacted the vineyard or the fruit from that vineyard was? And could we use the bucket fermentations to tell us whether we were going to have a problem with a larger scale fermentation? And I think generally speaking, and this is true not just for glycol, but for the other things we measured as well, the buckets are generally a little bit lower, but they're still predictive of higher, the higher ones have higher bucket, the higher buckets have higher bin numbers corresponding to them. So in general, it looks like the bucket fermentation, which was more or less the protocol that AWRI has posted at their website. The main difference is we increased the volume of fruit that we used because we wanted to have enough wine from this to be able to do sensor evaluation as well, which we've done. So, but aside from that, the protocol was more or less the same as what AWRI has been recommending. So what we found was we had generally pretty good correspondence between what the buckets were saying and what the numbers were for the bigger scale fermentations. So I know I've only got a couple of minutes, but key projects coming up for this year. We're going to evaluate this timing of exposure issue or question that Anita mentioned earlier. We looked at this a bit in 2017, and in that study we found actually the pre-veraison, 4 weeks pre-veraison lot actually had the highest level of smoke taint of any of the timings that we did. We're actually getting ready to do our first exposure next week, and right now we're in that vineyard this morning. We're basically just through shatter now, so by the time we get to it a week from now, we'll be at pea-sized berries, which will be our starting point, and then we'll do additional smokings every 2 weeks in other Merlot blocks within this vineyard. So that'll start next week. We're going to continue the work on the barrier spray. There's a couple more products we want to try. We're going to look at timing of the spray. So this past year, we did the sprays the night before the exposure started. We're going to try some earlier so that we can understand if you apply this stuff a few days or a week ahead of time, is it still protective when we have the actual exposure? So we're going to be looking at timing, looking at additional products, and maybe scaling it up to the use of commercial spraying equipment instead of just the hand sprayers that we've been using. We'll be doing bucket fermentations again this year, looking at the protocol a little more closely. There are a few things that we think we might want to change. We're also going to look at timing relative to the actual harvest date. So how far in advance can you pick and get a predictive response from the bucket fermentations? And then we have been doing, and I don't have time to go into it, we have been looking at our reverse osmosis enzymatic treatments, some of the things that Anita has already talked about for mitigation, for cleaning up wines that have been affected. So I think that's it for me. I will stop sharing so that Elizabeth can wrap up the presentation part.
So as Elizabeth is getting ready to present, I just want to invite anybody who has questions as they're now or as they're listening to Elizabeth, you can go ahead and start writing them into chat or raise your hand and we'll call you after Elizabeth is calling you after Elizabeth is done with her presentation. So go ahead, Elizabeth.
Great, and thank you to Tom and Anita, because there's a lot of stuff I don't have to cover. Now I can just get into my stuff quite well for this. So I primarily do a lot of work with sensory perception, figuring out what's going on once you've smoked out a range of things for it. This will go forward, maybe. So I do want to just go through a couple terms first, because some people, I don't want anyone to get confused for it. One of the areas in talking to a lot of people is they always ask me at what amount of these compounds is there a problem? And that is known as a threshold, except for there's more than one threshold that can happen. So I'm just going to go through and define some of the more important thresholds because we will be talking about this. But in sensory, you have a detection threshold, which is essentially you have a compound, its concentration increases until you can notice there's a difference in your wine. Doesn't mean you know what the difference is. It just means something is different. Then we have our next threshold, which is called a recognition threshold. And this is when that concentration of that compound increases so much, you can actually say it smells like smoke. Or if I remember correctly, guaiacol smells like cloves. So if you've increased guaiacol enough in your wine and all of a sudden it smells like cloves, you've hit a recognition threshold for that compound. And the last compound, which is being of interest for a lot of people in the wine industry, it is not that one. It is a consumer rejection threshold. Essentially, the concentration at which people would no longer purchase your wine. Guaiacol got so strong that they dislike that wine so much they're not going to purchase it anymore. So that's considered a rejection threshold for that. And traditionally for these thresholds, detection threshold is a lower concentration. Then you increase that concentration and you get recognition threshold. And then you increase that concentration even more and you get a rejection threshold. So it's very much increasing concentration for this compound. So those are what we're talking about when we talk about thresholds for sensory, and a lot of interest in sensory perception of smoke impacted wines really is interested in thresholds for it. Something else that makes being able to answer the question, well, what concentration is there a problem, very difficult, and Anita touched on that, is the fact that you have anywhere between 200 to 400 aroma compounds in your wine. And then you've got a bunch of other compounds, so ethanol and phenolics, which are for astringency and mouthfeel. You've got a lot of things in there for it. So I'm going to use an example from research here. The minute you take a compound and put it into a mixture, its threshold or your ability to perceive it changes. So this is an example of guaiacol. If you have guaiacol in air by itself, say you have a lovely squeeze bottle and you squeeze the liquid of guaiacol in air, you can smell it at about 9.9 grams per liter, which is pretty high for it. Now I take one other compound and mix it together with guaiacol and we squirt it into air and you smell it. All of a sudden, it only takes 0.75 grams per liter in air to smell guaiacol for it. So you just changed the detection threshold of that compound simply by having things in a mixture. And I'm sure if we add another compound and another compound, you're going to change the perception of that compound again. So me being able to tell people this is the concentration you want is extremely difficult because you have a complicated mixture that is wine for it. It's something we can certainly figure out in the future, but you have to look at everything. And I know Anita has done some work looking at some of these. We call them matrix interactions for it to see what's going on for it. So we know this already about guaiacol. And the reason I put this up here is if guaiacol has this effect when it's in a mixture, as in you immediately put it in combination with another compound and you only need a little bit to smell, whereas before you would need a lot to smell it. I'm sure all of the other compounds associated with smoke are doing something along this manner and changing things for it. So what are we doing? We're looking at two things specifically. Which compounds cause smoke taint in wine, definitively knowing that. There's a lot of work going on. You just saw Anita measures a lot of compounds, Tom measures a lot of compounds. Different companies measure compounds, but we've never had really great predictability with that for it. So I'm going to go into a little bit of work we've started on being able to know quite definitively which compounds are causing smoke taint in wine. And then we want to determine these thresholds for these compounds in wine, because those thresholds in wine is something that's going to be really important for making management decisions as people look at different mitigation strategies. You're going to want to try and do something that brings the concentration below whatever those thresholds might be. So potentially looking at detection and or recognition. And of course, a lot of industry is interested in that rejection threshold as well. So going to be looking at a range of these thresholds, because one thing I can tell you in all of my sensory work, winemakers' noses are very sensitive and they tend to like things at concentrations much less than your average consumer. So we might also have to look at a few of these looking at winemakers versus your average wine consumer as well. So something we've started this past year looking at is how can we definitively say which compounds cause smoke taint? So we are doing a project where we are creating carbon-13 labeled smoke. So for those of you that maybe are lacking in your chemistry or it's been a while, normally carbon is carbon-12 for it. In life, most things are carbon-12. There's a little bit of carbon-13 out there. It's an isotope. But we're doing something where we're increasing the carbon-13 quite a lot, because then you're able to track everything that has a carbon-13 for it. So I've put a picture up here of barley, because we are growing barley in high CO2, 13C CO2. I always say that wrong. 13C CO2. So we'll have, currently we're looking at about 20% carbon-13 in our barley. So then we can then burn our barley, measure what's carbon-13 in the smoke, and then we're also this vintage going to be exposing grapes to that carbon-13 labeled smoke. So by the end of this vintage, you'll see something that looks like this table on the right. So we'll be able to track what compounds, C13 compounds, are in smoke. We'll be able to track the C13 compounds that are absorbed into the grape. And then we'll be able to track the C13 compounds that are then found in wine after we make it. So we'll know quite definitively of these compounds that we think are important. I'm sure a lot of them are the volatile phenols, but we'll be able to say quite definitively that yes, these are the things that are resulting from smoke specifically for that. So we're quite excited about that. And we've got several batches of barley now that we can start burning this vintage to expose some grapes to our special labeled smoke. Then the next thing we're going to be doing, so we have that project we're working on. The other thing we're looking at is also what is causing this sensory perception in wine. So we just talked about tracking C13 labeled compounds, but then there's also creating that link between, okay, we smell smoke in wine and we measured all of these compounds, but what is actually causing a sensory perception? So we're going to be using some of the wines we're making, as well as wines from Anita and Tom that have been smoked out either on purpose or not on purpose, but naturally. I think Tom mentioned he had some for that. We're going to be doing some sensory analysis with that. We're also going to be doing a lot of chemical analysis, both for aroma compounds and non-aroma compounds, because we're going to be putting this through a new type of analysis that can prove causation for specific sensory attributes. So essentially, what this type of analysis will do once we have that sensory data and that chemistry data, it will be able to give us the combinations of compounds and at what concentrations will result in smoke affected wines for it. Because one of the possibilities of why we're not getting great predictive strength at the moment is there's probably a couple of different combinations of these compounds and what else is in your wine. So all those matrix effects that will result in that. So we're going to be running wines through this. So we can not only track them C13, but we can also run this analysis. And of those compounds, we're finding what is actually the ones important for sensory perception. Because not all of them may be important for sensory perception. So that's what we're going to be doing. I'm sure the people in Oregon are going to be very excited for all of the smoke sensory that is coming their way this year. Maybe we'll be able to get down to California and Washington and share a bit of the love in the smoke tainted wine for that. And yeah, so we'll be able to then take that information and start doing sensory tests for those thresholds. So this one up here I've put is one everyone's, I'm sure, familiar with about cork taint for it, but we'll be able to do additional sensory tests based on the compounds that are important for sensory and figure out the thresholds for those. And we'll also be doing those on different varietals as well. And I will tell everyone now, right now, it's not going to be a single number, but it'll probably be a range. We can call it the danger area if you need to, for that specific varietal. Because of course, Pinot Noir has very different characteristics than Cabernet. and that's going to result in different thresholds for those compounds. So we've got a lot of smoke affected wine that we're going to be tasting for it. But it is all achievable, and we're quite excited to get started with that. The last thing I wanted to let everyone know about is a grant that is being put in for smoke exposure. We, all three of us, of course, have different funding sources and research we're working on now from our states, the American Vineyard Foundation, other foundations as well for it. But we were successful last year, both myself, Anita, and Tom, in getting a specialty crops research initiative grant from the USDA to plan a grant specifically dealing with smoke exposure to grapes for that. I'm sure several people on this call were potentially at our California stakeholder meeting in February, start of February, and we managed to get all three state stakeholder meetings done right before everything happened in March for it. So that was a stroke of good luck. But we're currently in the midst of developing grant objectives for the grants from all of the feedback we got from the industry. They had a lot of great feedback on their needs and areas to focus on that. The tricky part of a lot of this research is some of it's quite linear. You can't look at everything at once. You have to do things one step at a time. So we were really able to sit down and look at the best way to proceed for that. We're currently developing objectives for the grant. It's actually going nicely on schedule for it. I have a nice bi-weekly schedule on getting things done for it. And it'll be submitted sometime in March or April 2021, and we're quite optimistic about funding, though of course it's never set in stone, but we've had a lot of work put on this, and we think it's gonna provide some very valuable and needed feedback for the industry on what they can do. Because this problem is not going away, unfortunately. So we do need to have some better strategies for how to deal with that. And that's all I have today. Thank you very much.
Great. So I know we already have some questions in the chat, so I think Karen's going to ask the first one.
So the first one is, have volatile compounds other than phenols been identified in this taint? And then what about the role of different tree species burning?
I can take that if you want. So this is where it's interesting. Primarily, most of the work has been done on volatile phenols for it. One of the reasons we're interested in doing some of that carbon-13 tracking is you could see if there are other compounds that are associated, but of course volatile phenols come from burning lignin, so that's why people are interested in that. It's a byproduct of fire. The different fuel sources potentially could provide other compounds for it. For instance, a lot of pine trees, if you had a forest fire that's primarily pine trees, and Tom, I think you've looked a little bit about this, so feel free to chime in. Yeah, pine trees have a lot of terpenes. So you could magically increase your number of terpenes potentially.
I actually have a couple of slides teed up if we want to take a look. I can share.
Oh, go for it, yeah.
So we've looked at fuel sources a couple of different ways because everybody can see the slides, right? Okay. So we started in 2017 looking at alternate fuel sources. Part of the reason we chose the smoker setup we did was to allow us to burn whatever kind of fuel we wanted. And so there was a discussion earlier about especially graduate student labor. They're really good at scouring the countryside for construction sites where there is plant material available to burn. So we had a collection of bins like this with 16, I think, different rangeland plant species from Eastern Washington, and we've looked at them all. We've looked at what's in the smoke, and we've used them to smoke the grapes. So in 2017, all of the smokings were done with rangeland plant materials. And so we've looked at things like sage and rabbit brush, cheatgrass, bitterbrush. We've got a long list. Let's see if I can get it to go to the next slide. We collected smoke from fires from different species and then looked at those using GCMS. On the top is a chromatogram for rabbit brush. The bottom is big sagebrush. And you can see there's a fair number of things that are present in both. But rabbit brush in particular has a lot of things in the back half of the chromatogram that are not present in the front half. And it makes sense. Rabbit brush is a very resiny plant. It was actually used, or at least evaluated, during the Second World War as an alternate source of resin for making rubber. And the students who were involved in this project will very definitively tell you their least favorite thing to burn is rabbit brush. The smoke is really just awful. And the species name for the rabbit brush we have here, I forget the genus, but the species is nauseosa, and that's the smell of the fruit and the plant material. And it doesn't get any better when you burn it. So the outcome is very different with rabbit brush, which unfortunately is one of the major plants in rangelands in Eastern Washington, and actually in lots of the West Coast. Just some of the things we've identified, the major things that we would expect to find in smoke, many of the compounds we've been talking about all afternoon, the cresols, guaiacol. We do see some of the xylenols, so the diphenyls, 4-methylguaiacol, 4-ethylguaiacol, eugenol. We get back out into this part of the chromatogram, we get into some heavier volatile compounds as well. So a lot of the peaks in the front half are very consistent. Doesn't really matter what you're burning, you're going to see these breakdown products from lignin. But when you get back into this part of the chromatogram, many of these plants look quite different. Okay.
Great. Thank you. So the next question is, in terms of spraying fruit, have you also looked at how those sprays affect the resulting wine outside of their impact on smoke taint compounds?
Not definitively, in our trials at least. What I showed was really what was present in the in the skin tissue. We didn't spray enough vines with each of the different materials to be able to make wine replicates with that. That's something we are looking at for doing this year. So we haven't looked at the impact of these things on wine quality or wine composition.
There's
just to show that we can see a reduction.
There's been studies on kaolin. I can never know how to pronounce it. And basically they've shown it has a slight fining action, but it's not severe. The normal way that you will apply to grapes for sunscreen or other things, it does have some fining action, but nothing too significant. It did impact the sensory of the wine greatly, but there's only been like 1 or 2 studies about that, and the focus was not smoke impact.
So before we go to the next question, I just want to remind everyone that next week at the same time, we'll have Ben Monpetit, Lucy Joseph, Kyria Boundy Mills, and Dave Mills talking about the future of wine microbiology. So the next office hours, that'll be on June 30th. All right, and the next question I believe is for Thomas, which is, are the vines exposed to smoke under the hoop houses? Will they be the same vines tested year after year? And then a follow-up there is, are smoke effects from one year seen carrying over in the following year?
So in our case, we're using this block at the research center near Prosser. We have basically have 4 varieties, 4 blocks of each. We've tried not to use the same blocks each year, so we often alternate between Cabernet and Merlot, so we haven't looked at year-to-year carryover. It's something that is on our list of things to do, but so far we've done Cabernet one year and Merlot the next year, so that we're trying not to do the same blocks because we haven't done the test to see if there is an issue. Most of the work that's been done so far suggests there's not carryover, but until we're ready to actually do that experiment, we've been avoiding using the same blocks back to back.
There's one more part to that question, which was, are there additional physiological effects on the vine itself beyond the fruit? Anyone can answer that one.
Yes, I'm answering questions in the chat. What was the question?
That someone wanted to know whether there are additional physiological effects on the vine itself beyond just the effect that it has on the fruit.
So part of the SCRI grant that we're applying for is to look into those kind of impacts on the vine. There isn't any research published that I'm aware of that looked into that. There is some studies that I know of that looked at stomatal conductance and those kind of things. And yeah, the stomata closes during smoke exposure. But I don't know if there's published studies about that. Do you know, Tom or Elizabeth? No, I know about people looking into it, but nothing that's been finalized. So then, you know, don't put the cart in front of the horse. But that is definitely something that we want to investigate as part of the SCRI.
Anecdotally, there's suggestions that there is a delay in maturity in smoke-affected vineyards. And I think we have seen that, although we haven't done that trial to definitively show it yet.
Okay. Next one.
So the next question is, the media bring this up every time there's a wildfire. Is there any evidence that ambient environmental cellar or crush pad smokiness can get into the barrels or open top fermenters?
I will answer that one because I was typing the answer, but now I'll just say it. It's been so if the barrels are sealed, I have tested some wines in barrels for a winery that was very smoky. If the barrels are sealed, the wine inside is protected. If your wine fermenters are sealed, they're protected. If they're actually fermenting, the carbon dioxide pushing out really protects it against the smoke. That said, yes, in theory, I don't know if somebody testing it, if you have wine just standing there and it's not sealed and it's open and you have fresh smoke in your winery, yes, it can absorb volatile phenols. It won't form the bound volatile phenols because the enzymes that do that get inhibited and die eventually in an alcohol medium. So that is not something you need to concern about. However, I do know sometimes people would go out, try and pick everything they can when the fire is coming, and then can't process the grapes. So the grapes are standing in a picking bin in the cellar and there's a lot of smoke. Yes, it can still absorb volatile phenols from that smoke. We think it will be slower because the enzymes do decrease in activity in the grapes after picking, but they're alive for several days. We do not know exactly how long, but there's been people that looked at studies into this. I know Australia has done some studies. They can absorb smoke for several days. So that is possible.
Yeah, and we have analyzed examples of wines that were picked prior to fires in 2017, but were in wineries that had smoke in the cellar, open top fermenters. And there is evidence that these wines have been affected even though the fruit was harvested prior to any fires.
Right. The next question in the chat has to do with, have you been looking into Kyleson Application in the vineyard as a spray for mitigating smoke markers? And have you seen any correlation with MOG contribution to smoke markers?
I think so. Tom talked about, looked at a little bit of spray. The Australians have looked at Kyleson, and for some it worked a little bit, and for some varieties it didn't work, if I remember correctly. So it's a little bit on the fence there, whether it actually helps significantly or not. I know Tommy's continue looking at that. The New Canadians have looked at a biofilm that seems to show a lot of promise. That is a proprietary biofilm that they're going to look at further. That did protect grapes somewhat. I don't think you're going to get something that's going to be 100% protective, because just thinking of applying it to a vineyard, you're not going to be able to dip every bunch in it and cover it 100%, and you still have leaves that are exposed. I mean, there's a lot of companies that are saying they have things that will work. I'm looking at it. I know Tom is looking at it, and the Australians are looking at it as well. So hopefully we will find something. Mark, I can say that there's been shown that leaves do contain a large concentration of volatile phenols. You do not want to include leaves in your fermentations if grapevines were exposed to smoke. No, that will be a source of volatile phenols. Nothing else I think have shown to really absorb it is really the leaves and the grapes themselves.
So the next question is there consensus developing regarding what compounds to analyze in order to determine the extent of smoke exposure?
I can answer that one for it. I can say probably no, there hasn't been great consensus. Traditionally in research from a paper from many years ago, it stated guaiacol and 4-methyl-guaiacol were sort of the main markers, but we now know that those aren't great at predicting. I know in some reading, I don't know if it's been published yet, they've shown that potentially it's other volatile phenols that we should maybe be looking at, which I know is why Tom and Anita tend to analyze the whole range of them if we can. We're certainly hoping by the time we get in the next few years that we'll be able to give everyone, you should be measuring X, Y, and Z. Consensus across the West Coast in all of our work for providing that information, because we do know being able to say these are the compounds you should look at is going to be very important for strategy, mitigation, looking at different techniques, and I know that's something we're all very keen on working out for the industry. Even though you have different fuel sources and things like that, as Tom showed, you have similarities in smoke. Smoke is still smoke, so it is the thought that it will be some of those smoke compounds that should be able to be used as markers. But yeah, I'd love to say that there's consensus, but at the moment, depending on who you ask, you will get a different answer.
I suspect there's also a varietal component to this as well, and that it may not necessarily be the same markers for every variety.
And actually, the next question is very interesting as well, which is, results from some of these compounds seem to differ from lab to lab as the research looks to develop threshold values. Is there anything being done to address this and reduce some of the variation from lab to lab?
I think it goes hand in hand that with also identifying what are the markers to identify, it will also be what's the best methodology to go about analyzing those markers. There are some inter-laboratory testing that we're doing to compare our results with each other. Canada, the US, and Australia is taking part in this inter-laboratory. So that helps always to be able to compare yourself with others to see if there's something you're doing wrong and you don't realize it. But yes, definitely we need to standardize it better so that we can compare data with each other and just make faster progress.
And I think it's not just the countries themselves, but also the entities that are offering the test, right? So it depends on the laboratory in the various, even within the same state, right? Can be variation.
Yeah.
And there's an add-on question to that. What's currently the best analytical method or sample prep method for analyzing smoke markers?
Okay, I'll say, and then you two can add on, Elizabeth and Tom. So at the currently for a researcher, we know if we want, the best prediction is to do at least the 7 volatile phenols that I've showed in the introduction, as well as the main glycosides, so the bound compounds for those 7 volatile phenols. And the best way is to do micro fermentations and analyze that. There's not a direct correlation always between analyzing the grape and analyzing the wine. If you can do a small micro fermentation and send that away for analysis, and the more complete the analysis, the better.
And what Anita didn't mention is you need some fairly sophisticated equipment to measure that. So you need a GCMS for your free volatiles and an HPLC, I believe, Tom, with an MS or a triple quad on the back end.
Yeah, I think
Also,
MS with a triple quad or a QTOF probably to do analysis of those markers, of the glycosides.
I think ETS has expanded their analysis. They're now doing the full range of volatile phenols. Are they doing bound as well? I think they're expanding their test to some bound, perhaps. I'm not sure.
I thought you can't get the standards in the country yet to do that.
Well, it will be semi-qualitative.
No.
That's part of the issue is for the glycosides, you pretty much have to synthesize them yourself. Prepare them yourself in order to have standards to work with for the glycosides.
Yeah, so that's been a limitation for getting those measured.
I mean, it's even a limitation for research labs, so I have empathy there. Yeah, so this has been part of the problem, is that there's not a lot of places that do the full range of testing, and it's really expensive.
I would like to put in here something we haven't talked about, and I did want to mention it. I don't know how many people saw the press release that went out, but there was money allocated to the USDA Agricultural Research Services for smoke exposure, and we're talking with all of them, and there is the thought that they would be involved in dealing with some of this methodology and standards, finding some baseline for things. So they're going to be contributing as well for that, and they have a lot of that chemistry background, and just, well, we all have chemistry background, but a lot of that set up to do some of this for it.
Great. Well, I think with that, I don't know about you guys, but I hear the theme music coming on in the background, which means that we've come to the end of our hour. And I want to take this opportunity to actually thank our three guests. Thank you, Elizabeth, Tom, and Anita, for a wonderful discussion, presentations, and answering questions. I want to remind everybody that we have the Future of Wine Microbiology discussion a week from today, 2 o'clock on June 30th. I'd like to invite you for that. And thank all of you for coming to another week of Office Hours with Dave and Anita.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thanks, guys. It was really a great presentation.